Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our study today. Um, as you remember, we are in Judges, the book of Judges, chapter 4, and going through some very interesting dialogue. Last week, we were uh, accustomed or met the character Deborah, and Deborah was described as a prophetess, which is one of the few, maybe just a handful of women in the Bible that are given that designation. And again, it shows us that God is no respecter of persons, and that even though maybe the culture at that time, I think, due mainly to outside nations and other nations, not necessarily Israel, was very male oriented. We see here that in Israel, and by God's choosing, Deborah was chosen to be a prophet. And so again, somewhat of a surprise for many people to know and to see that God is no respecter of persons, even back in what we would call the Old Testament, that he uses people who are dedicated to him, and it doesn't matter if they're male or female or nationality, none of that matters, or culture, none of that matters. God uses people who are submitted to him, and he chooses that for his purpose. And so that's what makes this passage very fascinating as we look at this um, Deborah being chosen as a prophetess and how she's being used. So as we pick up in verse 10, we see that she aligned with this man named Barak, and he calls up the nations of Zebulun and Naphtali to this area called Kadesh. And so he went up to this area with 10,000 men, and of course, he wasn't going to go unless Deborah went with him. I really liked that, and the fact that she had no fear. She knew God's hand was upon this situation, and she was not afraid to go into battle. Then suddenly we get this little verse 11 that's thrown in here. And what this does is it sets the stage for what's going to happen later on at the end of the chapter about this guy named Heber, the Kenite, and he was of the children of Hobab. And the clue here is looking that he was a relative of Moses. He was a relative of Moses's father-in-law. And what we put together from some of the previous passages where Moses had interaction with his father-in-law is that his father-in-law was a worshiper of the one true God of Israel, and that he aligned with them, even though he wasn't in the land of Israel and following with them and living with them. And so here is Heber, um, who still was a follower of the one true God of Israel, but he had distanced himself from the Kenites, and didn't we really don't know where his allegiance lay. But we're going to find out that he kind of straddled the fence, that he had an allegiance to Israel, but he also had an allegiance um, to Sisera. And so he pitched his tent right near where the battle was. I don't know if he did that on purpose or he just happened to be here and the battle was going to take place around him, but he was near the place that the battle was going to take place. And so verse 12 sets up this scenario that the enemy, led by Sisera, his spies came back and said that Barak was gone up to Mount Tabor. And so Sisera, thinking he's going to fight and win speedily, gathers his 900 chariots of iron together, and everybody that went with him. There were people that rode in the chariots, there were those that went on foot. So this was a very formidable army, and that they went over the river of Kishon. And then we get to verse 14, and it's like this battle is playing out, that Sisera is there, Barak's there, and Barak is kind of holding back. And it was Deborah who issues this charge and says, unto Barak, get up, get going. This is the day with which the Lord has delivered Sisera into your hand. And then she says this almost like maybe not a sarcastic, but maybe a, you know, get your act together, boy. Is not the Lord gone out before thee? And so there's a lot you can read into here. It's like, did Deborah have an understanding of how the Lord went out before him? Now, obviously, the Lord is a spirit. You can't see him. You can't see what he's doing, which obviously Barak was not able to. But from this, we surmise that Deborah did know. She had a spiritual insight. Did she see things in a spiritual realm? There are other fantastic biblical stories. One about the prophet Elisha, where he is confronted with the armies of Assyria, and everybody's freaking out. And Elisha says, "Hey, why are you getting upset? Those that are with us are more than those that are against us." And he prayed so that his servant Gehazi was able to see into a spiritual realm, and they could see the angels and the host of God's army all around them. Could it be that Deborah saw these things in a spiritual realm that Barak obviously couldn't see and that we cannot see today? That is something that just intrigues me. If I ever have a one of those wild prayer requests that, God doesn't have to answer, but if he ever wanted to, just to see into the spiritual realm, because we know it's there, we can feel it many times, and we know that there is a spiritual realm out there. These people had the ability to see into it. And I don't know of anybody in modern times who I can say has ever relayed that to me, that they had that gift or allowed that entry into that spiritual realm, but we see that it's there. So that's a lot packed into this little verse 14. And then it says that the Spirit of the Lord went and verse 15 discomfited Sisera. Well, that's a funny word. We can be discomforted sitting in our chair in the living room if we lose a good position. What did that mean? So I look into a Hebrew version of the book of Judges, and they quote from a man named Josephus, who wrote a commentary back around the time of Jesus. And so what he wrote was known as common Jewish folklore. And what he recorded in his book called Antiquities, chapter 5, it says that they were struck with a hailstorm, and the wind blew the hail into the faces of the Canaanites so that it darkened their eyes, that their arrows and slings were of no advantage, and the coldness of the air would not permit their soldiers to use their swords, while the storm didn't affect the Israelites because it came on their backs. So that is Josephus's take on what discomfited meant. Regardless if that's true or if it's not true, God moved in some way so that the chariots were discomfited. This is also reminiscent of when um, Pharaoh's armies chased after the Israelites when the Red Sea was parted and the chariots went into the sea, and God caused their wheels to fall off, that caused them to get stuck in mud, caused the chariots to break down. So the same sort of thing could have happened again here in Judges. Well, whatever happened, these guys were really toast, basically, and they were not going to have the advantage. And so Barak came after them, started fighting them with the edge of the sword. And Sisera, who was the leader, bolted. He got off his chariot because it wasn't working, and he started running away by foot. So obviously, he wasn't going down with the ship. He was not going to lead until death, like leaders are supposed to. And so he ran away, and Barak pursued after the chariots that were there, after the men, and all the host of Sisera's army fell, and there was not a man left, except for one. Verse 17. Sisera fled away on his feet to the tent of Jael. Now, here's where we learn about what happened in verse 11, why it was interesting and why we needed to know about Heber the Kenite. So somehow Heber the Kenite was not around, but his wife was home, and she was in the tent. And somehow Heber and his wife were at peace with the king of Hazor and meaning Sisera thought that they were allies. So they were straddling this in-between land of whose side are you on? Nobody really knew. But anyway, they were friendly with Hazor. And so when Sisera came upon the tents of Heber the Kenite, now where he was, why he wasn't home, why he left his wife all by herself in the midst of this battle that's running around, or maybe he was fighting. We really don't know. Anyway, she was home alone, and guess who knocks on the door? Sisera. So verse 18, Jael went out to meet Sisera, and he's really panicking. He goes, I need help. And she says, come on in, don't fear. And of course, he's weary from the battle. He's very tired. He lays down in her tent. There's all kind of social norms that are being broken here. It was not socially acceptable for a man to go unaccompanied alone into another married woman's tent. This was just breaking all the rules here. But again, this didn't seem to matter because he was trying to um, get shelter. And so what's interesting here is the exchange that takes place, and the how she must have relayed this story later on to Barak. It allowed it to be recorded in the book of Judges. And so here's this interaction in verse 19. He's trying to test her to see, is she friendly? Is she not friendly? And he says, can I just have a little water to drink? For I am so thirsty. You just ran from battle. You were in a big battle, running on your own feet. You didn't carry anything with you. And then instead of giving him water to drink, this is taken as a um, opening of greater hospitality. She gave him a bottle of milk. And, you can kind of see she's kind of coddling him a little bit. There, it's okay. You're tired. Here's a bottle of milk. You're safe here. Just lay down, take your rest. Here's some nice, doesn't say it was warm milk, but it obviously they didn't have a refrigerator. So nothing like a glass of warm milk to make you get real sleepy. She gave him the drink. She covered him. And he says to her, can you stand by the door of the tent and, here, tell, say this lie for me that if anybody comes here looking for me, obviously they can't just come barging in the tent because that breaks social protocol of going into a woman's tent unannounced and alone, and just you'll be able to keep them out and just say, no, there's nobody here. So she was standing at the door of the tent ready to do this, and he falls asleep. Then the real fun happens here. Look at verse 21. As he's sleeping, Jael, Heber's wife, took the nail of the tent, took a hammer in her hand, went softly onto him, drove the nail into his temples, fastened it to the ground, for he was fast asleep, and so he died. This is pretty close to the Hebrew, but I want to just and show you the Hebrew of it, how this sets kind of like a movie script. They didn't have cameras rolling, but visually they could set the scene, set the scenario so that you got all of the imagery in your head about what was happening. And so we see here in the Hebrew, it's reading from right to left. I'll put my cursor underneath that. It says the wife of Heber, a peg, a tent peg, and took in her hand a hammer in her hand. So she's got the peg, she's got the hammer, and went softly to him. He's sleeping. We assume his head is tilted on the side, and she takes and puts the peg near to his head and takes the hammer and drives the peg down into his temple, and it went down into the ground, for he was fast asleep and weary. And then Captain Obvious at the end, it says, so he died. Um, Again, just the imagery here of every little step. It wouldn't have to be here. It could just say that, he went into her tent, she hit him with a nail, and he died. But you get the step-by-step choreography of this as this was going around. This was a tough lady, a very strong-willed lady. Um, wasn't squeamish. Again, this was quite a episode here of hitting him with this force and driving this nail of the tent. Doesn't say if it was metal or if it was wood, whatever it was, it went through his head and into the ground. It was quite a blow. And then he died. And so we get to verse 24. And as Barak pursued Sisera, Jael came out to meet him and said, "Come on in, boys. Look, I will show you the man that you're seeking." And came into his tent, and there Sisera lay dead, and the nail was in his temples. And so God subdued on that day Jabin, the king of Canaan, before the temple of Israel. Children of Israel, and the hand of the children of Israel prospered and prevailed against him until they had destroyed everything of the king of Canaan. Again, just a fascinating story how God took two women in what was thought to be a very male-oriented culture, and that God used them to deliver the Israelites. Um, God has a sense of humor. You just got to have to know that, and that God is no respecter of persons, and that God uses male and female to do his will as he sees fit. And I think it's just a beautiful tribute here that God uses these two women and gives them such honor here, and that his glory, his will was done through two women that might have never been noticed any other time. And I think that's a great thing. And I think it gives us comfort and confidence today that no matter who we are, male or female, that if we submit ourselves to God, he can use us in his plan. Hopefully not like this, okay? Don't want to go on any camping trips and don't want to have any fear of anything like this happening. But again, we know that the fact is sometimes stranger than fiction, and you just can't dream this stuff up. You know that it happens, and you know that God's will takes place and has taken place throughout all of time, and it just gives us a great legacy. It gives us a great history to look at and to gain faith and to gain an understanding that God fights for his people. And now this is a different time and obviously different circumstances, but we know that God cares for his people down to the minutest detail of how he can come to our aid as he did come to the aid of the children of Israel. So again, thanks so much for listening to our lesson today. I hope it's encouragement to you, and we hope to see you again next week. Bye-bye.